everyone, I'm back and today I'm going to talk to you about Band 5 interview questions and a little bit about how to prep for Band 5 interviews. This is from my experience, so it's largely going to be sort of NHS relevant, but I'm sure the questions will be similar to what you may get if you work within private practice as well. So for the first part of the video, I'm going to talk to you about possible questions that might come up. So examples and kind of how you might answer those questions, and then for the second half I'm going to talk to you about what you might want to bring to the interview, and maybe things like what to wear and other things about like how to manage the actual interview itself. So for the first part we're going to be talking about examples of questions. I was asked, why do you think you might be right for this role? So it's really important when you're answering this question that you know exactly what the role involves. And I know that sounds kind of silly because you'd expect that you'd know what the role involves, but really having knowledge of exactly what it is that you will be doing within your team, within your role, department, whatever. And then when you answer the question and kind of talk about your own qualities, you can then fit that to the exact parts of the role, and that will really make sure that the interviewer knows that you know what you're talking about and that you've done your research and you've looked into the job and the trust. And that's also when you might want to be looking at things like the trust values and exactly what that department is maybe working on in the moment of time. If you've seen anything interesting on social media about that department, for example, new technology or something like that, you could say something like, oh, you know, I like to keep up to date with new research, and I've seen that your team is looking at this particular piece of technology, for example, and I, you know, would be really interested in learning about that more when I'm with your team. So things like that, so that they can see that you would fit perfectly into their team. This is asked in pretty much every interview I've done, even for Band 6 roles, and they ask, how do you manage stress or a stressful situation? We all know that working in healthcare is stressful, so they want to know how you're going to manage working in that stressful environment. So we've all done placement, so things like, how did you manage on placement if you had a stressful day? What would you do? Would you go home and cry all evening? Maybe. But how would you like get over that difficulty and that difficult day? So you might say something like, I would come home and I would talk to my friends, obviously confidentially, about my day and just explain to them why it was difficult, and that helps me process my thoughts. Or you might say, I like to play tennis, or I like to go running, and so when I finish my day I like to do those things to help me distract myself from a stressful day. Or you might say, I would like to sort it out in that moment then and there, so when I've been on placement I spoke to my supervisor and we regularly had chats and discussions about things that were stressful. Or you could mention all those things or other things, but it's just important to have some examples for that, because it's pretty much guaranteed that they are going to ask you that. Just have some tea, sorry. Another one that they will probably most definitely ask you about is prioritisation. They'll probably give you maybe an example of a few different patients, or sort of general descriptions of patients and their difficulties or what they're referred to you for, and they'll all say like, how would you prioritise this caseload? They may also give you examples of non-clinical responsibilities you might have to do, for example like training others and things like that, and then they might ask like, how would you fit that into your day? How would you manage that? So again, mention how you might have managed that on placement if you were given the opportunity to do so, which most people have been. How would you prioritise those patients? And just have a go, maybe practice that before if it's something that you're not sure about. Practice what your answer might be. And then if it's kind of prioritising clinical and non-clinical responsibilities, I would talk about things like, I have a diary, so I would use that to help me understand when I'm doing non-clinical things so that I can plan my day around that, and I would involve my supervisor. You might have a shared calendar or something like that, and you put on there when you're doing different things so that you can then plan basically each day and ensure that things get done that need to be done. Another one that they'll probably ask is about MDT working. So just have a bit of a think about maybe when you might have done some sessions with others, or thinking about different professionals and how you're kind of roles align. So I think I got asked like what are some positives and some negatives of interdisciplinary working. Another one, so thinking about kind of main client groups for the job that you've chosen. So if you've chosen a job in primary school, then thinking about some assessments and therapies that you might do with primary school children. Having a list of those or knowledge of those in your head before you go in, because I was asked, for example, how might you assess someone with dysarthria? But you could be asked like, how might you assess a child with a possible developmental language disorder or possible speech disorder, or how might you assess an adult who has possible aphasia? So you need to have a think of some informal and formal assessments potentially, if that's appropriate for your environment, and how you do those assessments. Those are the questions that you just need to have a bit of practice about. Write down some notes in your notebook before you go in and think about what that actually means, assessing those patients, and how you would plan for that, what sorts of things you might need. Just imagine you're doing a bit of a session plan and then you want to pick out the bullet points that you would share with the interviewer when they ask you. I was also asked that for dysphagia, I think, so I had to talk about a swallowing assessment too. So just have a think about what you might want to take, for example, to a swallow assessment, and the main steps of like the session that you might do. You might do something a bit more specific about a condition. So they might say like, how would you expect a person with Parkinson's disease to present when eating and drinking? Or how might you expect a person with dementia to present during communication assessment? Or how might you expect a child with a speech sound disorder to present during this particular activity at school, or something like that? And then you're kind of fitting your knowledge of the condition into that specific scenario they've given you. So again, in those sorts of situations, it's your time to shine, like it's your time to show the clinical knowledge that you have and kind of wow them with things that you know. And so those are the ones where you want to kind of have like a lot of knowledge, but before you might want to prepare a little bit of information before, just to get the clinical facts like in your head and easily accessible when they ask those sorts of questions. They will probably ask, particularly if you work within dysphagia, but also communication, I guess, you're told that client A's family aren't following the recommendations that you've put in place. What would you do? Or you're told that the staff at the nursing home aren't following the recommendations that you put in place. What would you do? Or staff on the ward aren't following recommendations, blah, blah, blah. You get it. So basically you come into a situation where someone's not doing what you've asked them to do, told them to do, and you've then got to answer like how you'd manage that situation, where you've got to ultimately tell them that like they've done something wrong, or they've maybe not understood what you said. You've got to manage that and manage risk and that kind of thing. So that is also something that you potentially might get asked. Your strengths and weaknesses, they may also ask about that, and how do you think that will affect you during the role, or how will that, I don't know, fit within our team or something like that. I would always say when you're talking about weaknesses, like to think of something that almost sounds positive, like when you're saying it, don't go in and be like, I hate getting up early, because, you know, obviously relate to that. But it needs to be something that's got like a bit of a positive spin on it. So for example, like I used to say I'm a perfectionist, so everything takes me a little bit longer to do. I like to get things right, so it can take me a little bit longer with tasks when I'm less familiar with them. I tend to like overcommit, so I like to do a lot of things and have a lot of in work and out of work commitments. So it makes you sound like an interesting person, because you're saying like, you know, my work and just my life, I don't know, I'm part of different clubs and stuff, so sometimes that can make me a little bit stressed. But then you don't just leave it there, you then follow up and say, however, you know, I've experienced on placement, this happened, and I did X, Y, and Z to make that work. So never leave a weakness seeming like a weakness, or a weakness seem unmanaged, because they're going to be like, oh, well, she doesn't sound like she would, you know, meet our requirements, so we don't want her or him. So you want to just put a bit of a spin on it. Say like, I know that I'm not great at this thing, which could also be taken in a positive way, but I manage it like this, and so it's not going to be a problem for you. So that's how you kind of want to answer those questions. And obviously strengths, you know, talk about things you're good at. That's easy. Okay, so then the last one. Tell us about a piece of research that you've read. So again, you want to make sure that this is something very specific to your role that you've applied for. So if you've applied for a role that's with children, don't say, oh, I read an article about adults with dysphagia. It has to be something relevant, obviously, to that role. But I would choose something that's quite up to date, something that's maybe a bit high profile. Doesn't have to be, but they might have heard of it if you say something about that. And then don't just say, oh, I read this paper by Mr. Whoever. I've read this paper and I found this really interesting. You know, for example, I've read the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapy's position paper on thickener, and I thought it was really interesting because obviously we're mainly taught at university to use thickener when there's problems with swallowing, and I read it and I found it interesting that there's obviously some conflicting opinions with this, and it makes me really think about my practice, and it's something I'm going to really take forward when I do my dysphagia competencies. Something like that. It doesn't have to be mega complicated at this moment, it's just showing that you're kind of interested in your subject that you've applied for, and it's something that's recent and relevant, and if you can remember the year, that's good to have as well, so that it looks like you keep up to date with up-to-date research. That's all the questions I'd got, but for the second part of this video I want to talk to you about the general sort of environment, things to expect, things to take, things to do within the interview. So I would say the first thing you want to do is just make sure you've read the instructions and information you get with your interview offer. So they will often say, like, you know, well done for getting your interview, this is going to be a face-to-face interview, or this is going to be an online interview. And then they might tell you to do something beforehand. So for example, in the most recent Band 5 interview we had within my trust, I think they asked them to present about like their strengths and weaknesses. As you kind of become a bit more experienced, they might ask you to present about like something you're proud of within your work. So they may ask you to prepare something beforehand. Some places also give you stuff to prioritise in advance, and then you come in and present why you've prioritised them in that order. Some places might not ask you to do anything, but it's just make sure you've read it so that you've done anything they've asked you to do, so that you're not caught off guard when you get there. The next thing I would say is make sure you've got a pen and paper. Some places will provide you with that, some places not. So I would make sure you take a pen and paper, and then when they ask you the questions, don't be afraid to write down what they've asked. Don't be afraid to just sit there for a moment, write and have a think. And if you feel more comfortable to, you can say, is it alright if I just have a moment to think about that? And they'll be like, yeah, of course, no problem. And then you sit and just have a little bit of a think, so you can arrange your thoughts before you give your answer, because we all know sometimes your mind goes blank and you're like, oh my god, I can't think of what to respond to that. I know, but I just can't. So if you just have a moment, look at your paper, write down a few notes, and once you get going, it should start to come back to you. So a notebook and pen is good. I would also say wear something quite smart to your interview. I always feel that this makes me feel more confident if I wear something that's quite smart and that I'm kind of happy with. But ultimately just wear what you're comfortable with. But I would say something smarter is the best, really, because then they'll remember you as well if you wear something a little bit different. You know, if you wear a colourful shirt or something, they might think, oh, I remember that person. They're interviewing lots of people. So just have a think about what you're going to wear. And take a drink with you again, whilst, you know, you might need it just because you're talking a lot. It's good just while you're taking that drink to have a moment and think. It kind of gives you a bit of extra time. I don't know, I quite like doing that. I would make sure you've written some questions you want to ask them, because at the end of every interview I've been to, they say, and do you have any questions for us? And if you just sit there and say no, then they're going to be like, okay, fine. You probably do definitely have some questions somewhere, so it's good to just have a bit of a think beforehand. Even if you're just asking stuff that you maybe know the answer to, or think you know the answer to already, I would just ask because it looks like you've considered it and really thought about it before you've gone, and that you're really interested in that job and that you want it, and you've taken time to think about questions. I will also always have them written in my notebook, so I'll be like, oh, hang on, let me have a look, get out lists of questions I've obviously taken time to write, and then I'll go through them with them. So it just looks good if you've really thought about it beforehand. The final one, well, I'll probably think of something else, but the final kind of thing I've written down is ask for feedback. So I would say if you don't get your interview, that's fine. It happens. I didn't get my first Band 5 interview. I would say make sure you ask them for feedback. Like, what did I do that wasn't quite right for you? What could I have done? Because ultimately it's a learning process. You're not going to know how to answer these questions if you've not done these kinds of interviews before. So, you know, asking for their feedback, there's nothing wrong with that. And they might have some suggestions of things you've not thought about before. So I would just make sure you ask for feedback. So that's kind of everything I've written down. I'll probably think of some more things. If I think of any more questions, I'll write them down in the description. And if you have any questions, please let me know. It is kind of job interview season, I guess, coming up, because lots of people are finishing their degrees or coming to the end of their degrees and thinking about applying for jobs. So if that is you and you've got a job or you're starting to apply for jobs, then good luck, and I hope it all goes okay. Do feel free to ask me questions. Again, like I said in my last video, I'm totally happy to respond to your questions and give you a hand where I can. If this was helpful and you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a like and subscribe to me if you want to see a bit more content about healthcare or speech and language therapy or anything like that, because I've got a few more ideas for videos that I'm going to be doing soonish. So yeah, I think that's everything. I hope that was helpful. Good luck for everything in all your applications, and yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for watching. Bye.